Hello, everyone, and welcome back on a new episode of the UCL Corner podcast. Today is a special episode as Patrick Kendrick is joining me for an episode about the biggest disappointment in the UCL this season. So, Patrick, welcome in the UCL Corner podcast. Thank you very much for your time. For those who don't know you, you are a reporter for UEFA and BT Sports. You are a press conference interpreter, and most importantly for today's episode, you are an Italian football expert, right?
That's correct. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. Yeah, that was a very good summary of my CV so far. So thank you, Grégoire. I appreciate it.
Can you tell us a bit more about yourself about before we dive in?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I've been living in Milan. I'm originally from Winchester in England, but I've been living in Milan now for coming up 10 years. It'll be 10 years in July that I've been living here. I commentate on the Serie A world feed. So what that means is we commentate on matches from the Italian top flight in English, and then they are distributed to broadcasters around the world, whoever the English language rights holders are in that country. And sometimes our commentaries are even used in territories that aren't necessarily English speaking, Japan, some countries in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So it's great in terms of visibility. It's wonderful to have people reach out to you from all four corners of the globe, and you realize the reach of Serie A. So it's very gratifying. And then on the other side of things, I do some reporting, typically on Italian clubs for British broadcaster BT Sport, who are the Champions League rights holder. So I haven't actually reported on Juventus this season, but I've reported on Milan, on Inter, and on Napoli in particular. And then finally, yeah, I work as a conference interpreter as well. So I work with the European Union, and I work with FIFA, with UEFA. So some nice variety in terms of work there. Yeah, I work with Italian, French, and Portuguese. Those are my working languages.
All right. So thank you very much. That's also a really good introduction of yourself, I guess. So yeah, today's episode is about the biggest disappointment. I could have talked about Barcelona, obviously, about Atletico de Madrid too, but Barcelona was in the so-called group of death, and I really think, considering even more the what happened on and off the pitch, Juventus is really one of the biggest surprise and disappointment of this season. They finished third of their group. They finished behind PSG and Maccabi Haifa and Benfica, and they also lost against Maccabi Haifa.
Mm.
So, how could you explain this failure if we can tell about Juventus this season and what happened for them and maybe also the consequences in this season?
Absolutely. I think it's hard to explain. I think we've all been scratching our heads here in Italy because traditionally, in recent years, Juventus have been the club flying the flag for Italy in Europe, particularly under Allegri. In his first spell, they reached two Champions League finals, 2015 and 2017, and they were always considered the team best equipped to go and win the Champions League. If an Italian team was going to end that long drought since 2010, when Inter last won it under Jose Mourinho, but it hasn't happened this season. And they've got a lot better as the campaign has worn on. The problem for them was they had bad form domestically in the autumn, and they had bad form consequently in the Champions League in those months of September, October, and half of November. I think the real issue was it was an even more condensed Champions League program because of the Qatar World Cup. It meant we had to be done by mid-November as opposed to mid-December. So as a result, there was that very busy run of matches. And Allegri has said throughout the season, it's quite a simplistic view. I think he does it to avoid too much scrutiny of his own tactical shortcomings that we saw in the early part of the season. But throughout the campaign, Allegri has constantly said, if you're missing a lot of your key players, it's much harder to win matches. So he was alluding to the continued absence of Federico Chiesa through injury, the fact that Paul Pogba joined in the summer, but then we haven't seen him play at all. I think he played for just a handful of minutes against Monza recently. So that's been frustrating. Di Maria has been brilliant since coming back from the Qatar World Cup, but he had a frustrating time through injuries, then suspensions. So he was never able to really consistently pick his first choice team. And I think that didn't help. And I think the group, it's interesting you mentioned the group of death. I think history will probably tell us that maybe Juventus were in the group of death, given how well Benfica have done now.
That's it.
They're into the quarterfinals. They're up against Inter. Many people have them as favourites to beat Inter. And they've had a wonderful season under Roger Schmidt. So I think there's a combination of people underestimating Benfica, which has often been the case in Italy. People tend to be quite dismissive of Portuguese teams over here.
Mm-hmm.
And also, yes, Juventus underperforming. I mean, 5 losses from 6 is just unprecedented for them. I think it was their worst ever Champions League campaign. Their only win came against Maccabi Haifa. They didn't keep a single clean sheet in those 6 Champions League matches, whereas I think they've kept more clean sheets than anyone else in Serie A now. So it was almost a perfect storm, really. Juventus have got better as the season's gone on, but unfortunately, all of those Champions League matches were concentrated into the first part of the season, and you know what it's like. The damage is done fairly early on. I mean, I think it's unforgivable to lose away to Maccabi Haifa.
Yeah.
You know, in a group, typically Sir Alex Ferguson, the great Manchester United manager, used to say, if you win your home games, you only need 1 point elsewhere and you qualify for a Champions League group. Again, it's quite a reductive notion. There's a lot of truth to it. It's easier said than done to beat Benfica and Paris Saint-Germain at home. But I think in this group, you knew you needed to take 6 points against Maccabi Haifa, as Benfica did, as Paris Saint-Germain did. And then I think after that, you need to hope that you would beat one of those other 2 at home and then try and get a point away from home, either in Paris or Lisbon. But it was a very challenging group. But then again, we saw just the fine margins in the Champions League, really. If your listeners remember, Paris Saint-Germain looked like they were going to qualify in first place. There was a big sort of controversy because I think Benfica had lots of added time, scored at least once in added time. Galtier was caught on the wrong foot, surprised by all of that, and then suddenly found his team finished second. They drew Bayern Munich, and the rest is history. PSG have gone out and Benfica into the quarterfinals. So it is a strange competition, the Champions League. We've seen that with PSG. They're a great example. However much they invest, however often they change their coach, they can't get over the line. Juventus went so close in 2015 and 2017, thought that, okay, if we sign Cristiano Ronaldo, who individually has won a lot of Champions Leagues, he will then take us that extra step and we can finally win that competition. That actually ended up setting them back several years. And now, despite Allegri being there and him winning 5 league titles in as many years in his first spell and taking them to 2 Champions League finals, they feel further away from the Champions League final than ever before.
Yeah. And yeah, as we said, Allegri come very close to win the Champions League with Juventus, but in the last season, Juventus is really quite disappointing in a general manner. Like Sarri lost against Lyon. You have Pirlo that came to the club as a manager. That was a huge expectation for him, and he lost against Porto. And last season, there was the defeat against Villarreal, but Villarreal was again one of the biggest surprise. They even take Bayern out, so maybe it's less shocking. But how could you explain the recent downfall of Juventus in the Champions League? Because in the league they were still good, but in the Champions League it's more deeper, I think.
Yes, I think some of it, you can't even necessarily put it down to style of play, because some people have said this season that the reason Milan, Inter and Napoli are doing well in the Champions League and Juventus failed is because they tried to play a more attacking, positive brand of football, whereas Allegri is a bit more plays it a little bit safer in terms of being rock solid defensively, and that's not necessarily a style of play that will get you very far in Europe. I don't think that's true, because Pirlo's Juventus, albeit we only saw it for 1 year, tried to play on the front foot. Sarri's Juventus, again, he was only there for 1 season, didn't help. And I think we're getting to the heart of the matter there. Typically, teams do well when they have continuity in the dugout. We've seen that with Milan now, with Pioli, who has built the stepping stones towards winning the league. They won the league last season. Yes, they've had a bit of a blip this season, but they seem to be benefiting from having continuity in terms of the coach. Juventus, after Allegri the first time, had Sarri for 1 season, Pirlo for 1 season. Now it's Allegri again. So I think it's very difficult to get consistent results when the players are having to listen to different voices in the dressing room on a regular basis. But you're right, it seemed to be a psychological hurdle that they had when they got to the knockout stages of the Champions League, because I think those games, as you correctly listed, against Lyon, against Porto, against Villarreal. I think they all came at the last 16 stage. So I think it becomes a case of that seemed to be a bridge too far for Juventus. The issue now is that they didn't even make it through the group stage this season. So they're actually statistically getting worse. Villarreal, as you said, were a surprise package. So similar to what we've seen with Benfica this season. Porto, it was a strange one. We were still in the era of away goals counting double. And I was there actually at that game. Sergio Oliveira scored a late free kick to send Porto through. And Stacey made a mistake from that. And then Lyon, that was the lockdown season.
Yeah.
And I remember Rudy Garcia's Lyon weren't particularly fancied, and yet they had quite a good run in that competition. But that was a team with Bruno Guimaraes. That was a good Lyon team as well, I seem to recall. So it's a combination. It's never one factor. I think it's a combination of Juventus underperforming and perhaps underestimating some of these teams. It was a strange game. For at least two of those, they were behind closed doors. I remember Juventus Porto. I don't think there were fans in the stadium. There certainly won't have been when they played against Lyon. So maybe there's something in that. But again, no one legislated for, no one expected Juventus to fail so badly this season in the Champions League, particularly when Allegri came back. When Allegri came back and when you saw what they did in the summer transfer market, bringing in Kostic, Pogba, Bremer, Di Maria, everyone said, wow, Juventus have spent big. They've made a statement. This is the team that are going to challenge for the Scudetto. So to see them, yes, they've had a 15 points penalty. And if they didn't have that, they would be in second place in Serie A. But the league table tells us they're out of the running for the top four at the moment. They've gone out of the Champions League at the group stage. They may still win the Europa League and qualify for the Champions League as a seed. They may well get their 15-point penalty back. We'll find that out later next month. But as things stand, it has been a disappointing season for Juventus. It doesn't mean that they can't go and win Serie A next season, but in terms of the Champions League, this has been very underwhelming.
And if they win the Europa League, is it still a failure, or would it be something great for them and kind of catch back the season? Because if they win the Europa League, they're back in the Champions League. It's the quickest route for them.
Yes, I think since the change in format with the Europa League, since they rewarded the Europa League winners with a place in the following season's Champions League, but not only that, they also gave them a seeding in the following season's Champions League. I think that is a very reliable route and it's added prestige to the competition because now you know that not only can you win a piece of silverware, but on top of that, you've got a big chance of doing well in the following season's Champions League because suddenly you're a seed. So your group is that much easier because you have a team from pot 2, pot 3, and pot 4. So I think if Juventus were to win the Europa League this season, which is no guarantee, they're on the tricky side of the draw there. And there are some very challenging teams in there. Manchester United, Sevilla, Roma. There's no guarantee, and even to get past Sporting, I think will take some doing. Yeah, and we've seen them struggle against Benfica. So, it's not a case of, an Italian team should beat a Portuguese team. We've seen them struggle already. I think if they were to win that competition, they would say it's a success. It's a piece of silverware. It's a piece of European silverware. It would get them back in the Champions League, whatever happens with the points penalty, whatever happens in terms of any potential disciplinary repercussions, unless that extended to UEFA level and they got involved. But I think with everything that's gone on off the pitch, I think it would be a good way of saving the season. So I think Allegri will be keeping an eye on what his team's points total is with a possible 15 to be reinstated. But I think his focus will be on winning the Coppa Italia. They're in the semi-finals against Inter. First leg of that is coming up next week. And obviously they're now into the quarterfinals of the Europa League as well.
All right. Do you think Allegri is still the man of the situation to get Juventus on track?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah. Do you think Allegri is the man of the situation to get Juventus back on track, or do you think they should maybe try with someone else? In the recent few weeks, there was a lot of change and rotation in huge coach in the world football. So do you think they should stick with Allegri or?
Yeah, I think they should stick with Allegri. I think he's he's done enough. He's got enough credit from what he did in his first spell to deserve a second opportunity with them. I think it's hard to build something um, too significant. This is now his second season back in his second spell. So, he got them into the top four last season. He also got them to the Coppa Italia final. Didn't win any silverware last season. So I think it's important that they can claim a trophy with him this season, which is why the Coppa Italia and Europa League will be so important. But I think Allegri commands respect in the dressing room. I think the senior players like working under him. And I don't think it's a viable option for Juventus to keep changing coach. I think they need to keep Allegri. And if he can challenge again for the Scudetto next season, then that will obviously bring benefits with the Champions League as well. So I do think he's the man to continue.
All right. And we have a last question. This season, we've seen the like of Sule, Foggioli, Miretti, Baranecchia all having some game time and step up in the first team. Do you think it's a project from Allegri or just the fact that there's a lot of injuries and a lack of depth in the team, so it's not really a choice?
I think it's a combination of factors. I think they were missing some players, and so he gave those young players an opportunity. I don't think he would have played those young players if he didn't believe in them. So he clearly has some faith in them. I think the ones in particular, Miretti and Fagioli, are the two that have played more than anyone else. Sole, we've started to see come into the team recently, got his first goal against Sampdoria. He's looked quite exciting. Baranechea, to me, looks at least 1 or 2 years away from being at Juventus level. I think he would need to go out on loan. And the same goes for Illing as well. Although he did play well. I remember he came on away at Benfica and made a bit of an impact there. So I think they've got a couple, Miretti and Fagioli in particular, are two that could definitely play on a regular basis for Juventus in coming years. So I think it's credit to them for the project they've done with the next gen, the under-23 side, which is certainly producing results, getting these young players used to playing first-team football, men's football in the third tier of the Italian game. So I think Allegri is starting to see young players come through. He does believe in them, but of course, if he has Kostic fit, he's going to play Kostic and not Illing. If he has Leandro Paredes at the top of his game, which we haven't seen this season, I think he's more likely to play than Miretti. So I do think it's a case of if he's got a full squad to pick from, we'll probably see a more experienced lineup. But that doesn't mean that Fagioli and Miretti won't have very exciting futures in the game, and the same for Sole as well.
All right. And as is the tradition in our podcast, just a last question for Jen. What's your prediction? Who will win the Champions League this season? That's a tough one.
I would love to say one from the Italian half of the draw, where we've got Milan, Inter, Napoli, and Benfica. I have a hunch the winner's going to come from the other side of the draw. My feeling is it's finally going to be Manchester City's year. I think Guardiola might finally win. Yeah, so there we go.
Okay. So thank you very much for your time. It was very interesting to have you on this podcast, and you're the first guest of our podcast. So it's really, really nice to have you today. And yeah, thank you for everything, and I hope to talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, Grégoire. Good luck with the podcast.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in for this week's podcast, this special episode of UCL podcast about the biggest disappointment in the Champions League. I hope you enjoy, and I see you soon. Bye.